Hey everyone, welcome back to the Layback Podcast. Joining us today is the chaplain at the Chapel of Cheddar, Carter Hohn. Carter Hohn is the owner, operator, founder of Full Send Performance, but the cute little title we gave him of chaplain of the Chapel of Cheddar fits his facility perfectly. His facility is located about an hour away from Pittsburgh and is housed inside an old church. So if you want to throw hard and pray to the baseball gods, I guess that's the place to be. Carter's had quite the background. He really specializes in return to throw and performance training. So we're really excited to get into those topics today. But I'm going to kick it over to Carter so he can take us through a bit more of his background. Thanks again for joining us.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me. A little bit about myself. I'm not 30 yet, but I'm getting there. Just finishing up my master's degree in strength and conditioning from Logan University. I decided to take that for a little bit of fun after doing some certification courses and whatnot. But as far as like my own playing career, I'll be the first to admit it. I sucked, but I basically used my body as like a human experiment per se. So I went to a junior college for 2 years, took a gap year, trained up at Driveline in Seattle for a while, did 1 year at an NAI, and then finished up my senior year at a separate NAIA throughout that time frame. Freshman year of college, tore my labrum in my shoulder, had to deal with all that fun stuff, kind of drove me down the rabbit hole of throwing rehab, as that one is definitely not one many can say that they've come out the other side of on the right side of things. And then junior year of college, I actually had an ulnar nerve transposition. So that's where I started to dabble in figuring out what's going on in the elbow a little bit. And as my playing career finished, just kind of transitioned into coaching pretty quickly. I found out that I was a lot better at that than I was at playing. And when there's only one team interested in you when COVID starts, the odds for you aren't very good. So just kind of started to make that transition and then started Full Send Performance about, my gosh, we're almost exactly at 2 years now. Opened up the Chapel of Cheddar here in Pennsylvania about a year and a half ago. And yeah, now we're here. It's been a blast getting to this point.
I think maybe the first point to even dive in on is the little thing you said about you had this amazing discovery that you were way better at helping people get better at baseball than getting better at baseball yourself.
Yeah, my career was really interesting. Going into college, I did not throw hard. I was in 78, 82 guy. I got up to 84. Let's be real, if I was graduating high school right now, I probably wouldn't get to play any college baseball because of how much things have changed, and it's only been 10 years. But, using that time frame as experimenting with myself. We were figuring out the weighted balls, we were figuring out velocity development. Obviously, now we know that we can train velocity incredibly efficiently, but I had like no emphasis on the ability to command the baseball whatsoever. So I sucked at commanding the baseball. Just to put it simply, I could spin it really well. When I decided to throw strikes, it was a really fun outcome. But other than that, the outcomes typically weren't all that great. Then my junior year of college, I actually took over a 16U travel ball team and really started to see what the magic of my knowledge was at that point in time, because then it was no longer about just the performance side of things. We actually had to win baseball games and stuff like that. And I think when I took over the team, we had, initial velocity testing day, I had guys pulling down like 65. And I think rolling into that summer, I probably put them through the most rigorous practice schedule they'd ever been through. We were at like 3 times a week for almost 6 months leading up to their high school season. They basically didn't get an off season. Obviously, throwing changed quite a bit during that time. But I think by the time the season started, I think we had like 5 or 6 guys on the mound that are sitting like 80, 83. We had one kid getting up to like 86 as a 16-year-old. And at that point in time, like we thought we were pretty good. And at that, and just very quickly realized like, hey, I enjoy this just as much as I enjoy playing, but I'm way better at it. Like we were having success. Like our first tournament, we went down to a tournament at Fort Scott Community College in Kansas. At that point in time, the showcase was a pretty big deal. And I remember we played a perfect game, top 25 ranked team. And I was like, wow, we just won. I didn't think we were going to make it past the third inning. Like, this is really cool. And then that just kind of stemmed. And from there on, I just really put more emphasis into coaching than I ever did my own playing career, which, I don't really have any regrets about that. You could find the old Casey Weathers video of, you don't know what you're capable of until you empty the gas tank and whatnot. I didn't even want to empty the gas tank. Like I found that I was better at the coaching side of things. As you've probably noticed through our conversations, I'm a weird dude. I'm not great at talking to people, but for some reason you get me around high school and college kids trying to get better at baseball and like I'm just in my element. It is a lot of fun to me and I've truly enjoyed getting to watch all of the different types of success that I've been able to help guys with, whether that be getting a college scholarship, getting promoted from double A to triple A. I haven't had any guys make a debut that have come up with me throughout the entire time yet. Hopefully we see one this year.
Yeah, it's coming.
Um, I hope so. But yeah, it's just kind of, I've really, really enjoyed that. I mean, there's even been points in times where I've enjoyed doing the classes with little 12-year-olds, right? Like you get a different enjoyment out of each level of guy that you're trying to work with. I've just really fallen in love with that. And then at that point, I don't even really watch baseball anymore. I just love coaching it. I'm sure as you've noticed, you work your entire life around baseball. Sometimes when you go home, the last thing you want to turn on is more baseball. So lately I've transitioned to watching quite a bit more golf.
It's a bit more relaxing watching the green rolling hills and not envying them. Just it's simple to be a couch armchair golfer. I feel really good about being an armchair golfer because, yeah, of course, I never would have made that shot. I would have drained it.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I'm right there with you.
Yes, but one of the things that I do find innovative that you might not even think of it as such based on your training background as a player when you took over the 16U team your junior year of college, so I don't know the exact timeline. What is that, 2018?
Yeah, probably late 2018 going into 2019.
Okay, so even having a group of 16-year-olds do a velocity day testing, that's still kind of new in that time frame. So you expose these kids to a type of training that they probably hadn't done before. I
Hmm.
remember my senior year of college, grad year of college, so 2016 and 2017. And we had to beg to get the radar gun out. We had one as a staff, and knowing what you threw, you had to like kind of backdoor your way into finding out how hard you were throwing by asking who was working the radar gun that day. But you had to be on their good side to find out because if the coach found out that you were sharing how hard people were throwing, you'd get in trouble. Yeah, all that weird stuff. So then
Yeah.
actually putting that information in front of 16-year-olds, it's crazy how much training can change when they know where they're at and they know where they want to be and you just start measuring it. I'm sure a lot of the gains that you guys had early on, especially with that younger adult group in a sense, where they're so malleable, they can make adjustments pretty quickly, they can get better pretty fast, is just as simple as, guys, this is where you are, this isn't good enough, this is where we need to be.
Oh, 100%. That probably had more to do with it than the training protocols. I think any good coach, as time goes on, you try and get better year by year, and every year you look back at what you were doing the year before and you were like, man, I was an absolute idiot. And that's exactly how I felt about the entire situation. But I had to remind myself eventually, like at the end, like all the guys that wanted to play college baseball ended up getting college scholarships. We had multiple dudes on that team end up throwing 90 plus. So yeah, it was one of those things like I didn't know what I was doing, but I knew if I measured things and talked about the results, then they were going to push themselves regardless. This is in the middle of nowhere, Kansas. I mean, the town that this travel ball academy was in was like 1,000 people on a good day. So straight up middle of nowhere. So we would do like all kinds of fun bets and stuff like that when it came to like velocity testing. I had a core group of guys, about 8 of them, that would come in and do like an actual velocity development class on top of playing for the team. And there would be days where it was like, all right, well, the bet of the day is this kid versus this kid who can PR by the most on their pull down. And at that point in time, most of them just did 5 ounces. I didn't let any of them do 6 and 4 and 3 and all that kind of stuff. They just weren't ready for that. But I mean, we had bets of, hey, you got to take a paintball to the bareback from 10 feet. I mean, we had all kinds of like the craziest things. And I'm just sitting there like pumping these kids up. I'm like, yeah, you don't want to get hit with that paintball. Like, let's get after it. And it's wild how much it works, especially like with kids that age. Like, they don't care about what they're actually doing. Like, they're just trying to win. They're trying not to get hit by a paintball. They're out there having fun. And I think that was a huge testament to like what we tried to do with that team that year. We tried to push guys and we tried to do the little things right. I think we made 11 errors in like 39 games that year with 16-year-olds. So I was thoroughly impressed. It made me stop getting questions from the parents on why we took 3 hours worth of mass fungos per week. But like just fun stuff like that. And it was really fun to see the transition working with those kids and trying to take all of the knowledge that I've learned about performance training and just trying to integrate it into like, hey, this is how we can use it for working in game scenarios. I mean, before they did hitting every practice, like we had like 15 to 20 minutes of med ball work and they were just getting better at rotation. Next thing you know, we had guys on that team. I think only one kid on that team had ever hit a home run. And by the end of that year, we had like 9 that had hit home runs. Just random stuff with performance training, but they were so malleable, like you said. Like it really did make things a lot of fun.
So even sticking on this team for now, what was your appetite at that time for throwing on ramps or acute to chronic workload? I don't know if you knew those phrases at the time, but maybe you were just intuitively working those systems into the process. Because you talk about pulling down and doing this velocity training. I'm sure there's some kids out there that think then all I need to do is just go rip baseballs as hard as I can 5 days a week and I'll throw harder. Yeah, you'll probably throw harder, but you're also likely setting yourself up for failure in some capacity. So what did that look like even back then?
First and foremost, don't just go with pull downs, please. Do as I say, not as I do. But yeah, it was interesting. At that point in time, I had taken myself through 2 of my own rehab processes. So I understood the ramp up process pretty well, or I thought I did at that point in time. I had only done one other return to throw, and it was for my college roommate who had gone through TJ. He came back from his doctor's appointment after TJ and handed me the lovely sheet of paper that we've seen 1,000 times with his return to throw program. And I just laughed and I was like, yeah, we're not doing this. Like this, I can't allow this to happen for someone that's living in the same house as me. But yeah, I think big thing at that point in time was I had guys getting introduced to throwing plyos. So we did probably about an 8-week ramp up before they actually had their first max intensity day. Obviously, I wasn't tracking workload or anything like that. We didn't have sensors, but the one thing that I was tracking was number of throws, the weight of the throws that they were doing, and just slowly trying to increase it. I think over the course of that 8 weeks, we started with about 60 throws, and I tried to increase by about 15 throws per session per week, right? So maybe week 1, we had 3 sessions of 60 to 80 throws. Week 2, it was 80 to 100 throws. Week 3, it was 100 to 120, so on and so forth, and just kind of kept building it in that direction. That was also really the time in which I was starting to understand, because that was also the first year that I put on a MODIS sensor at that point in time, now called Pulse, obviously. But I think I went through a start that year where I threw like 95 pitches or so. And then I looked back at my pulse data and I was like, yeah, I made 347 throws today. What are we talking about? And we're trying to tell kids like, yeah, your 20-minute throwing session is totally going to get you ready for that first start. And I'm just sitting here like, no, 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 we need to throw for like an hour. Like, and that might get us prepared for our first start. So really trying to ramp up like number of throws because most people have will completely underestimate the number of throws that they're making in a given day. And I found that it's even worse with pitchers. Like we're thinking about numbers of pitches. The number one thing that I've seen lately, probably within the last like 2 years, when guys like ramping up into a season, is they might get to it and they're like, well, I've done 3 sets of 15, so I'm ready for 3 innings. And I'm just sitting there laughing. I'm like, you might be ready for one. Like you forgot to include the fact that you have to throw a pregame bullpen. You forgot to include the fact that you have another eight pitches of warmups. All of a sudden, we're at the same pitch count with a pregame bullpen in 1 inning. So obviously, you're not as prepared as you really want to. So I've kind of transitioned into this goal of like preseason. I want to build guys up to the point to where we're doing 5 sets of 15 pitches, and I'm like, yeah, you can walk out there. You're good for 3 innings. We've tried to expose ourselves to twice as many throws. I know that the stress level is going to be lower. So once we increase that stress, we're going to pull back the number of throws and we should be at least somewhere close, a lot more prepared than what you would have been if you said, well, I've done 3 sets of 15. I can go out there and throw 3 innings now. Like you're going to be absolutely fried after that. So I think that was one of the big things that I kind of learned through that transition is you have to think about over preparing guys. And if you over prepare them, they might be prepared. So that was kind of like the big learning moment for me going through that.
You bring up kind of an aha moment when it came to you looking at your Modus sleeve and understanding how many throws are actually occurring on a game day. What other maybe discovery type moments did you have that started shaping the way that you were thinking as you transitioned to more program building, not just experimentation?
We can manipulate the ever living crap out of a throwing workload. That was the biggest thing that I've kind of really come to terms with. I think back on it, I went through, there's two main like research articles that came out from Driveline that kind of shaped this. Number one was being flat ground versus mound throwing and comparative stresses, which was fun because I was actually a part of that at the time and had no idea. I think I'm still the like banner picture for that article, which is really cool. But I've had guys transition to the mound a lot earlier and more often because we found out it's actually less stressful than throwing on flat ground. Not by a lot, but like there is a small amount of stress decrease by throwing on the mound. You just have better leverage. So I think that is one thing that really transpired through that process is having guys on the mound more often and being okay with it. We don't have to throw flat ground short boxes. We can just throw real short boxes, stuff like that. But then we can also manipulate the crap out of a throwing workload given the weight of the ball that we are throwing. I think there was that article that Driveline came out with comparing the stresses of all of the different plyo weights and whatnot. And I have found if I do a rocker drill with a red ball, one day it might correlate to a point 0.2 workload on a pulse. Or I can do 8 split stance throws with a blue plyo ball for a point 0.2 workload. So how do I want to manipulate this? Like if I may have my workload goal, but how can I get in the most amount of throws and really, really try and hone in that craft? So I spend a lot more time working on arm action specific drills, heavier balls than most people would. I know that's becoming increasingly uncommon, but I also know that it's the easiest way to manipulate the workload and get in more throws. So there's a drawback to it. Early on in a return to throw, we're definitely going to take that route because I want guys to become more comfortable, get the arm to relax, and so on and so forth, and just get reps in, right? Versus later on, like I might not care about getting those extra throws in within that workload because our workload limit might be high enough to where it doesn't really matter, right? Like those extra 30, 40 throws throughout the day aren't going to matter as much. But if we can push intensity a little bit sooner that day, then we kind of take that trade-off.
That's a really good point. It's insightful. I haven't thought a ton about that, and I'm glad you brought it up regarding not all throws are created equal. So I like the way that you broke down how we can manipulate workload. And the way we can manipulate it, if we stick to this kind of pulse modus structure or the acute to chronic workload theory, there are weights to a given throw at a given intensity or given velocity at your size, and it adds up to what we're chasing down as a total acute workload for the day and then stacking that to build our chronic workload, right? So what you said or what you were leading on to is early on when we're working with an individual, we can treat our goal for the day as that acute workload value, not as much the throw count. And with that kind of added variability in the mix, we can spend more time on constraint-based drills or different throwing techniques that can help the athlete advance in their process from a skill-based perspective, not just from etching away at a throw count that would magically get them better.
Yeah, right. Like kind of like going down that thought process. I figured out I've probably done here's a good example. Here's an OG Modus sleeve. It still says Modus on it. I have probably thrown 100 plus thousand throws with a pulse slash Modus sensor on, right? So I've learned a lot about like what kind of goes into it from my own self experimentation, but like we have the weight of the ball, which is gonna directly impact arm speed. Okay, we know higher arm speed, lower arm speed is going to regulate stress and workload. And then we can also talk about like whether it's a plyo ball or a weighted baseball, those things are going to change as well. The weighted baseballs are typically going to have a little bit more stress from my experience than the plyo ball will. And then we're also going to talk about like what drill are we using, right? Like, are we doing a normal split stance throw where we're just going through a regular arm motion? Or are we doing it with a little bit more momentum where we're going through a figure eight and trying to get a little bit more flowy? Well, that's probably going to relate to a little bit more arm speed. So even just small adjustments to drills will change how much the workload is actually happening per throw. So really just trying to find what works for each case. I know it's been really popular to say like, hey, no return to throw should look the same and whatnot. But I think I have a process that I like per se, but every single one of them still ends up looking different. And I think that's the part that actually matters is, we have to be able to change as things are happening and figure out the right route for that specific athlete, right? Like I have one guy right now who I'm working with who hates plyo balls with passion. Okay, well, that's going to change things. How do we manipulate this now? So then having him do leather weighted baseball drills to create lower arm speeds rather than plyos. Okay, well, this is already immediately more stressful. So our throw counts at the very beginning ended up looking a lot lower than what I was expecting because most of the time when I'm starting guys off, I start them off with plyo balls, which there's a lot of arguments on that right now as well of whether or not we should be throwing plyo balls first, whether we should be throwing underload first, a traditional baseball overload first. Obviously, based off what I've said so far, you can probably interpret that I go with overload first. But then I think another major aspect that a lot of people don't take into account or don't think of or understand is the fact that for guys who've torn their UCL, I haven't met anyone who's torn their UCL throwing a plyo ball, but almost all of them have happened in a game throwing a baseball. Okay, well, the brain knows that the baseball is what hurt them. The second you touch those seams, and we can go down this rabbit hole a little bit later talking about the nervous system, you're going into protective tension. The second you touch those seams, your body's going to go into protective tension until you've taught it that that's no longer going to trigger you, it's no longer going to hurt you. So why would I put a baseball in someone's hands if their brain knows that it's what hurt them and they're not going to be able to relax into layback? They're not going to be able to have a flowy arm swing, and they're probably going to get a little bit pushy with it, which we know is more stressful to begin with. It just seems like a really bad idea to me to put a baseball in someone's hands for their first throw after TJ because their brain is going to have so many issues with it, whether they understand it or know it or not. It's just not going to be the same. So I've kind of transitioned to like getting guys started off with, we're going to start with a red plyo ball and we're just going to do 20 throws on day one and see how your body reacts and see if you can fall into layback or not. And then we're just going to build from there. At the very beginning, I might write out 1 or 2 weeks of throwing return to throw at a time until we get to like that 6, 8, 10 week mark where someone's progressing, and then I can start to do it a month by month time as we're starting to transition into it no longer looking like a return to throw program, but looking more like performance training.
I both hate and love that you tease that nervous system piece already because I really like want to chomp at that and get into it. But I had other questions in the process before we get there. One of which being, do you have any idea why the weighted leather baseball is a more stressful throw than the plyo ball? I'll take a hypothesis if you have one. I'll take fact if you have it. I just find that incredibly interesting.
I don't have fact, I just have personal experience. And I think the biggest aspect of it is you're not throwing it to a wall. You're going to relax a little bit more and you're going to throw it harder. I think that just is, I think that's kind of like my little bit of hypothesis to it. But then the other thing, like if I'm trying to think about the psychology aspect of it, is when you hold a plyo ball, it doesn't feel threatening. Like it is soft. It doesn't feel like it can hurt you, even if someone threw it at you as hard as they can. Like there's nothing about it that screams like this is going to be painful. But if you've ever picked up an 11-ounce leather weighted baseball, it feels like a shot put. Like it is dense, it's a brick. That feels like it can hurt you. So I think that might have a layer of plausibility as that being a factor as well. I have no idea. I don't know why it's higher stress. It's not a massive amount by any means. If I were to think to myself, if I did a like a figure eight pivot pickoff with a blue plyo ball, typically I'm at like 8 to 12 Newton meters of valgus stress on a pulse sensor, which is incredibly low to begin with. But then whenever I would do it with an 11-ounce ball, I would be at like 16, 18, maybe even 20. So why that was happening, I have no idea, but it was something I noticed early on. But then if we take that step a little bit farther, I actually utilized that into the return to throw. I was like, we can find a way to manipulate this as well. So what I've had guys do now is, once we get to them to the point where they can get through a full plyo set of however many drills with whatever weights are needed for that specific person. Some guys I'll have do 3 arm action drills and like 3 moving drills. Some ends up being like 4 arm action drills, 6 actual movement based drills, like whatever it may be. I'll actually, like when they're finished with that, I'll have them go back to the heavier weighted leather balls, go back a couple drills, and then repeat them going through the leather weighted balls, going down in weight, working into a normal baseball, not only for the proprioceptive factor of like feeling the weight and going through the exact same drills, but then for the psychological aspect as well is we feel the weight like the plyo ball, so we're going to be able to relax a little bit more, but now we're adding in the factor that we can feel seams. So kind of helping them with that transition of moving into a normal baseball, which for some reason, most guys struggle to go into layback and actually relax with. But if we go through this process, all of a sudden it seems like they don't have that issue because they're already confident in their ability to throw by the time they actually throw in normal baseball. So I know that that's not something that is common, and I know that it's not necessarily something that is used quite a bit within return to throw, but it's something that I found to be incredibly effective.
What drove you into this psychology-esque realm, thinking about these topics, trying to figure out how they apply to the individual, that I believe had to happen from somewhere, just natural inquisition? What was this that drove you here?
So first and foremost, just I can't remember if it was an article that I read or a video that I saw, but just someone, I think it was a random speech. And I might have even seen it in like an undergrad class, just like talking about injury and the psychological factor that happens with injury. That was definitely something that sparked my interest to think about it differently. But I think the bigger aspect is like going back to the first rehab that I did for someone else. This was an individual who pre-TJ was incredibly pushy, hypermobile, but didn't ever reach layback. So I was really confused. This individual, if I crank them into ER manually, they can probably get to significantly past parallel with the ground. And I was like, there's no reason this person should have a pushy arm action. So we just started with plyo balls instead. And I was like, what just happened? Like, I think his first day of throwing and just terrible. I think his first day of throwing, I gave him green pivot pickoffs at
Heavy.
post TJ. Yeah,
Heavy
heavy.
for anybody that isn't familiar with
Yeah,
ball weights. What's a green?
2.2 pounds.
Yeah, I was about to say 1
Like
kg.
an absolute boulder. But immediately it was the cleanest his arm action had looked in like 2 years. And I was like, well, there's something to this. And then we just kind of kept playing around with it. Week 2, I had him get into the point where we did our first like couple baseball throws, and it was immediately back to like a super pushy arm action. I was like, yeah, no, we're not throwing a baseball again for like another 6 weeks. Like, I don't even want to touch him. We're just going to work on throwing and feeling that again. And then kind of went through that transition. We got back to a baseball, and it was still a little bit pushy. That was kind of ingrained in him for well more than a decade at that point. But it was the best his arm action had ever looked, as far as pushy aspect actually starting to get layback. I think his first max effort bullpen, we were hitting all-time PRs on velocity. So at that point in time, I was just like, well, we're gonna keep experimenting with this. We're just gonna see what happens. And I think that's one aspect of like how I do return to throws a little bit different. Like, yes, we try and use as much data as possible, but at the same time, I still view it as an art, not a science. I mean, I think there is a lot of art that goes into it, because you do have to have some feel. Data can't tell us everything. Whoop score doesn't measure dog. We can't go on that. We got to find like a happy medium to utilizing tech, but then also not becoming inundated to that data and making it king, right? Like, we still know that we have to push things. We still know that sometimes we might want to push things, but we can't. So just kind of like having that feel and art form aspect being added back into it, which is funny that we say this as I'm starting a series covering all of the tech that we're using for myself.
It's a give and a take. But
Yeah.
also, I think that goes to the individuality of programming. You look at an individual, the art form is the implement you might be using or the drills that you prescribed to an individual. I think that's where you'll still see the art in your return to throw is you want to do correctives or constraint-based throwing that enables you to achieve the movements that you are chasing, but you're going to use data along the way to ensure that you are making the strides that you need to make to be healthy. It's both sides of the coin.
Yes.
How do you individualize to feel healthy? And then how can you check to ensure that the measures that you're taking on the art side are backed by a science-based approach?
Yes, I think that's the perfect way to say it. Yeah, I don't even really have anything else on that. That was pretty much
Well, yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. I do feel I've gained a bit of a better understanding of how you're incorporating the art in the process. I like the idea of getting away from the throw count in a sense and more focusing on what work is an individual prepared to do on that day and figuring out a way to value that work. So
Mhm.
that's where we get the individualization. It's not so much that it has to be everybody does something entirely different because this mover does a drill, it means it's bad for somebody else. No, that's not necessarily the case. You can get into the implements that you use where you can differ from guy to guy. You can get into the volume where it differs from guy to guy. It looks like
Mhm.
you're chomping at the bit to get back in here, so I'm just going to shut up and let you go. I don't know where you're going, but I'm just going to shut up and let you go.
So one of the fun aspects of how I do return to throw is like, yes, we're going to pick the right drill. Yes, we're going to try and pick the right weight. But a couple months ago, I actually had two guys, they're on the same college team, reach out to me. I'm doing both of their return to throws. I have a really good relationship with this school. And they reach out to me and like, hey, why are we doing the same return to throw program? You said was individualized. And I said, pay more attention. They couldn't figure it out. The one thing I said was, compare your arm speeds. So when I write out their programs, yes, I'm picking the drill. Yes, I'm picking the right weight of ball that we're going to be using with it. But the other thing that I'm programming is a maximum arm speed or an arm speed range for that drill. Now, we know that the pulse isn't perfectly accurate when it comes to arm speed. It has an error of up to 75 RPM in either direction, but at least we can get close. I have had a big leaguer who can hit 98 at 900 RPM, but then I also have an 18-year-old who tops 86 at 1500 RPM. We can't treat that process the exact same way. The dude who throws 98 at 900 RPM, his arm speed goals should be significantly lower than the kid who can reach 1500 RPM. We know arm speed is a large correlation with velocity, but then there's, again, it's not rocket science. Like there's some art form to it. We have guys who can throw incredibly hard with low arm speeds. The same way we have guys who have high strikeout rates with low spin rates. We have to own the fact that everyone is different. We can have goals and we can have expectations or guidelines on what we want guys to be able to achieve. We have an understanding of where we want spin rates to be, preferably. We have an idea that this was going to be the average arm speed of someone who throws this velocity. And it's great to know those things. But if you don't have prior knowledge of the athlete, I think you're just kind of shooting blanks. Like you're throwing stuff at a wall and hoping something sticks if you're trying to program arm speeds. But if you have someone who has thrown on a pulse pre-TJ, if you have videos of them pre-TJ, and then even better, if you have videos of them throwing as a kid to where you can look at like what their most authentic movement patterns are going to be, I think that can really give you some better guidelines on how to treat that specific individual rather than treating it as a regular case of like, hey, this is just the guy who walked in, this is our protocol. I think that can make some really big changes for you. I mean, I made that mistake a couple months ago. College coach said like, hey, he's a really, really high arm speed guy. And I was like, yeah, sure. And I was like, I don't see it. He might be high, but like he's not insane. Like I personally got up to like 1400 in college. Like my arm moved very fast. I didn't think that this kid would be peaking at 1300 at 70%. I was expecting like 750, 800, maybe 900. And day one, I got 1300 back. And I was like, okay, everything I wrote, like, we're just going to erase all of it and we're just going to start over because like this is not going to work. Because like the first thing that he said was, tried to hit my arm speed for this drill. It was supposed to be at 600, but I looked like a robot and I couldn't get into layback. So I went up to 750, 800 for a couple of reps, and all of a sudden everything got smooth again. And I was like, okay. So then you just start to kind of figure out where another art form of it. Like we may want a specific arm speed for a specific workload, but if it's going to be really robotic and they're not going to be able to relax, then it doesn't matter anyways. We have to try and move along what's going to be athletic and smooth, even though the arm speed might be higher than we want it to be. But if it's smooth and it's relaxed, odds are it's probably going to be less stressful than if we're trying to hit the arm speed anyways. There's give and take on so many different aspects when it comes to the return to throw that I don't think you truly can have a blanket process for anyone. You can have blanket ideals and guidelines, and I think that's about it. Like everything else, like it's just so different person to person. You just kind of have to be able to work through it with them. And if you're doing a remote return to throw, if they can't communicate very well, you're just kind of screwed to begin with. Like communication has to be A1.
I'm sure you deal with that often since 90% of your business is remote anyways.
Yeah.
But I wanted to take a quick step back, again, asking you for fact, hypothesis, personal experience, anything. When you bring up a guy can throw harder with a lower arm speed, although we know arm speed has some sort of correlation to velocity that's been shown time and time again. Guys who can throw hard with lower arm speeds, are they just generating the force from somewhere else in their sequence, in their system?
I think that's a really good question. I think it can be different person to person on like what that aspect might be on why they can throw harder at a lower arm speed. Some of it might be strength related, but then I think a larger portion of it is going to be the mechanical sequencing side, right? Like the more efficient they sequence, they don't have to move quite as fast. And I think the other thing that I've noticed is guys with longer levers tend to have lower arm speeds to begin with because they don't have to move violently, right? Like in college, my mechanics looked a lot like Tim Lincecum for a reason. You've met me. I am 5'8". In college, I was 160 pounds and I had to find a way to sit 90 plus. That wasn't going to happen by just moving traditionally. So I really experimented with those kinds of things. But then, yeah, like for some reason, a name that comes to mind that's been able to do high velocities at low arm speeds is Ben Heller, right? He's a Milwaukee guy, or he's from Milwaukee, just signed with the Cubs. He's been up and down injury plagued for the last 6, 7 years, whatever it may be. Works with tread athletics and then kinetic sports medicine and performance, which I know we both have a relationship with as well. But that dude can sit upper 90s with sub 1000 RPM arm speed. Meanwhile, we have little Jimmy, who's 14, right next to him, top end 74 at 1300 RPM. I'm starting to get to the point where I view arm speed similar to spin rate. We can control some, we can't control all of it. And this part of it is just like, hey, this is what you're gifted with.
I would guess maybe on that, I'm just spitballing here, but maybe the intrapersonal relationship with arm speed matters significantly more than the interpersonal relationship with arm speed.
I would think so. There's only been one return to throw guy where I like made arm speed an emphasis, and that's because the kid was hitting 90 miles an hour at 800 RPM, and I was like, this is wild, this is not right. Like your arm is moving like molasses and you're hitting 90 miles an hour. With that kid, we actually had a big underload emphasis to where he can create more arm speed and have a good feel for what that is. I think after he finished his TJ rehab throughout this last fall, he's been able to take average arm speed on max effort days up like 75 to 100 RPM. Doesn't really sound like a lot, but for him, it was massive because the things that have come along with that is, not necessarily a lot more velo. I think velo's only gone up another 1 or 2, but spin rate has also gone up. And to me, like that's probably a pretty good trade-off for that kid, as he wasn't a very high spin rate guy to begin with. I think it can go a lot of different ways, but typically I'm not just sitting here saying like, hey, let's train for arm speed. If we can move efficiently, if we can sequence well and the velo's popping up, then like I don't care what the arm speed is. If the velo's not popping up and it looks like we're moving pretty well, even better if we can get some biomechanical data that says like, hey, we are moving really well, but arm speed is just really low, like then maybe I'll think that as the main prerogative of training. But it's pretty rare that I view it as like, hey, let's just do arm speed work.
Makes sense to me. And without a better transition available, I just want to jump into the neural stuff. You teased it earlier, and I think I'm ready. I'm mentally prepared. Unless there's other stuff in the return to throw that you feel like we haven't covered that you want to hit on. The neural stuff I find very interesting just from our private conversations. I think you can educate the audience here. So if you want to start bird's eye view and just slowly just scoop down towards the earth and give us the nitty gritty at the end, that would be great.
All right, so I'll try and cover the things that I can legally talk on. Basically, I train the nervous system using a system called Square One, created by Sean Sherman. His main office is in Chicago. Then the guys who actually got me into it are Jared Slater, former Tread employees, just starting his own facility in Charleston, South Carolina in the next couple months, and then Rob Blanc, which most people in the industry are going to know who that is without me saying anything about him. Kind of got into this, and the main thing that was being told to me is like, hey, we're not allowed to really teach you what this is, but all we can say is it's going to change everything. And I'm just like, yeah, totally, like the biggest skeptic in the world. And I was like, as educated as I am, as many courses I've taken, like the knowledge that I've tried to obtain, like there's nothing that's going to just tell me like, hey, everything I know is wrong, I need to transition. I was wrong. Everything I know is wrong and I needed to transition. The interpretation of it is Square One is a way to interview the nervous system. We're trying to figure out if specific joint actions, muscle actions, really anything going through any type of sense, right? Smell, taste, sounds, you name it, whether or not that is triggering your nervous system into a protective tension state. And then we're trying to reorganize the nervous system to no longer view that item as a threat. That's kind of how it works in an overview type way. But if you're trying to understand what occurs, I kind of take the black box theory with it is here's what goes in, here's what comes out. There's a bunch of stuff that happens in this big black box in the middle that none of it matters as long as I know what happens over here. So with square one, you never know what the outcome of your work is going to be. Getting into it a little bit more, like there's ways that we can predict, there's ways that we can try and work on more specific things, but with the general consensus of level one is you don't know what the outcome is going to be. And the ideal behind it and like the way that I've explained it to where people can understand it a little bit better is the nervous system controls everything in your body. Right? It's electrical currents going from one place to another, making sure communications are happening, make so that processes can be started, whether that be chemical or mechanical, like it doesn't really matter, right? Like everything starts with an electric communication of some sort through the nervous system. So I view the nervous system as a really, really, really big tangle of speaker wires, right? And within all of these speaker wires, there's thousands of little connections, and all of those connections have frayed endings to where within that speaker wire, we may have 100 copper wires. Well, maybe only 5 of them are still touching. As we try and clear the neural issues or dysfunction and cleaning up the inputs, we're trying to reconnect all of those wires and make sure that we have a more solid conduction of those currents. And by doing so, the output of whatever we're trying to achieve typically gets more efficient. Now, we can think about this in the simple terms of like the main way people are using square one or nervous system training is to get people out of protective tension so they're no longer in pain, right? Like we deal with a lot of guys, people with back pain, the normal stuff. But if you have a little bit more of an open viewpoint on square one and nervous system training, you can utilize it in any way that you really want to. So I've also utilized it in terms of motor learning. I've used it in terms of power output. For instance, a split squat, right? Like, what if just going into a split squat and doing it with no weight is triggering your nervous system to where your output is low? Okay, well, if we clear the movement pattern, we clear the loading mechanism, where maybe holding the weight is no longer triggering our nervous system either. What if you find out that you can produce like 40% more power output than you thought and you've never been able to do it before, and all of a sudden you can do it in 5 minutes and it doesn't go away? To me, that seems like everything that we know about the human body is probably not quite that accurate, right? Like if we can make these large amount of changes incredibly quickly, that can change everything. One way that we can kind of put it into like return to throw or something along those lines is, I know we're both pretty familiar with the TJ surgery itself and what happens, but at the end, before they sew you back up, what do they do with your arm? They slam it all over and make sure that it moves and it's going to stay stable. Well, then why can't we move it an hour later? Like, why? Like, why is it in a brace and why can't we move it even if we try to? That doesn't make any sense. Then we get to this point like, oh, main thing is let's regain all of our range of motion and our elbow extension and so on and so forth. And maybe that takes 4 to 6 weeks. What if we can do it in 10 minutes? That speeds up the process quite a bit. Right now, maybe not the ligament maturation process of like it becoming an actual ligament, but if we can get to the point to where we're training the musculature that much faster because we don't have to deal with trying to regain ranges of motion, we're just getting rid of the protective tension that comes along with the surgery, then my thought process is we can make everything happen quite a bit faster. So square one and nervous system training, like there's only so much that I can say about it because it is a business. Like there is things that I'm not allowed to talk about when it comes to it because we want other people to take the courses and get educated on it as well. But it can truly make some absolutely massive changes. For instance, Jared Slater's made a couple posts about me of what was going on during the course that I took because he was actually present for it. But I actually took that course 3 weeks after partially tearing my UCL. Topic for a different time. I was being an idiot when I did that. I took it 3 weeks after I tore my UCL. I didn't know how torn it was at this point. Now we know that it's about 25%. But I was still in a significant amount of pain. And after going through, I don't know, 5 to 10 minutes worth of work, he just tossed me a tennis ball and said, "Hey, throw this." And I was like, "Dude, I just tore my UCL." He's like, "Yeah, I know. Throw this." And I threw it and I had no pain. And I was like, last night in bed, I could literally just lay my arm back and like I was gonna feel like there was a knife in my elbow. So then you kind of I kind of got to the point where it's like, okay, well, are injuries really that big of a deal, or is our body just telling us they're a bigger deal than they actually are? Like if we can rehab a partially torn UCL in half the time, which we're about to experiment with ourselves, then like what's actually going on here? So trying to interview the nervous system, figuring out like it could be a multitude of different things that are triggering you. And I found that for people with less robust nervous systems who haven't gone through a lot of neural training, pretty much anything and everything is going to trigger your nervous system into a protective state. Like I can sit here and wave my hand over your hand, and your little hairs on the top of your hand are going to feel it. That's probably going to trigger your nervous system. Like it really is that simple. Like the smallest things can trigger you into a protective state. So I've kind of gotten to this point where my thought process is by the time that you're 30, if you're not doing nervous system training, odds are you're only functioning at like 50% capacity on anything, whether that be cognitive, mechanical, whatever, like pain levels, you name it, like you're operating at a very low potential and you could be operating at a much higher potential. I mean, I've had guys with ADHD come back to me after their first couple sessions and like, "Hey, I quit taking my ADHD medication." I'm like, "Why would you do that? Like, you're a space cadet." And they're like, "I don't need it. I can literally just be present, can have a better understanding of what's going on around me, and so on and so forth," to the point where like they don't have to take their Adderall or their Vyvanse, whatever ADHD medication they're on anymore. I've had guys where it's like a pitching coach that I was with at ABCA that you met. He has a torn labrum in his shoulder and it's been torn for 10, 11 years. Yeah, I messed with his eyes for about 3 minutes and he hasn't had shoulder pain since. So there's no good way to explain it other than like going through it and having someone take you through it, but it is the wildest thing ever because we can go into like the weirdness of like, hey, constraint throwing drills, like they're focusing on this. Well, if the nervous system's in protective tension, they're not working on anything. But if the nervous system's not in protective tension, you might not even need that constrained drill because they might just move more efficiently and move more authentically without you having to do anything. I've had guys' mechanics change after just going through a 30-minute square one session, not talking about their mechanics and not working on throwing at all. Like we might just do a square one session where we're working on triggers that are purely visual. And the next thing you know, their mechanics change and velo's up like 3 or 4 miles an hour. And you're just sitting here like, all we had to do was get the body out of protective tension. Like, I think that really can open up a lot of doors because then the second like your body is no longer viewing the things that you're doing on a regular basis as triggering, every aspect of the human body can become more efficient. If we've had that understanding that everything is happening through an electrical current and then that process is becoming started, whatever it may be, whether it's protein synthesis, whatever, if every single aspect of it is becoming more efficient, that sounds pretty good to me, right? Like if our muscles can recover 25% faster just because our nervous system's working better, that means we can train harder. That means we can train more often. If we can learn a new movement pattern faster, sweet. Be that 10-week time frame in which we were going to be working on mechanical stuff before we go into a velo phase, maybe now that's only 3 or 4 weeks. And now we have more time to go through a velo phase, which means we can have the potential for adding more velo. There's hundreds of different ways that you can use it, hundreds of different ways to think about it, but the big overarching emphasis is we're just trying to clean up what the body is interpreting. That way, the output of whatever it interprets is more efficient and more robust. One good thing that I like to look at is the overhead squat, right? Like you can see minor changes in an overhead squat pretty easily. You can see the spine angle. You can see whether or not the hips dump under. You can see the center of mass shift based off shin angle. Like you can see a lot of different things. And if I have someone do an overhead squat first time, shin angle is going to be a little bit more vertical. Hips are going to be dumped under just a little bit. And when they get to the top, they can't quite get their arms in line with their spine. They're going to be a little bit further forward and hunched over a little bit. Next thing you know, you go through 15 minutes of square one work, and we've doubled the shin angle. So the center of mass is shifted more efficiently. The hips don't dump under anymore because now we've opened up range of motion, or we'll call it mobility, because we can actually utilize that range of motion now at the hips. And then we have better core and spine control. Next thing you know, that the spine is in a straight line. Like all of these things changing, and we didn't work on the overhead squat at all. So you're just starting to clean up the processes going on within the body to where it can do almost anything more efficiently. That's my current understanding of it, right? And I think it is going to continue to evolve over time. I've definitely started to experiment with it on some other sides of things that I'm not willing to talk about quite yet, that we can potentially have some fun with on later on. But the results of it have been absolutely mind-boggling, to a point where I had a kid that's in return to throw. He had internal brace, and he's at 18 months, and he was stuck at 84 miles an hour. And this is a kid who's been up to 90 pre-TJ and would normally sit 86, 88. Not really any issues, like just for some reason, like just wouldn't come out. Elbow would get stiff after throwing, not really painful, just like stiff. Whatever. We go through first square one session, and all of a sudden, like, elbow stiffness isn't happening after we're throwing anymore. I'm like, okay, cool. Well, we're in the middle of a deload. I just fried your nervous system by training it. We're going to extend this deload a little bit more and see what happens. And the next velo day that he had, we're hitting PRs. And, just last week I got a video of him and his most recent bullpen where he sat 87.0 to 88.9 the entire time. Now, PR isn't matching what we hit pre-TJ, but the average is already higher than what we were at pre-TJ. Now, don't get me wrong, it's been a really, really long process for him. We've had quite a few random setbacks of like, how could we have seen this coming type stuff. But next thing you know, like, we have no issues after we've involved square one. I have another kid very similar. He's a couple months further behind in his process. Another internal brace guy that was having issues trying to get back to previous levels. I just got a video from him 2 or 3 nights ago, and he had popped his first 90 since TJ. He was stuck at that like 86, 88 range for like 4 months, and we could not blow through it. And I'm sitting here, I've thrown everything at him. We've gone to like time frames where we just like quit lifting. We're doing all power and output work, like all sprints and plyometrics and all that kind of stuff. Velo still wouldn't budge. And I'm just sitting here like, I have thrown everything at this kid. I take this course. I go see him in person. We go through a little bit of a session. I go through a couple more sessions over Zoom with him. And the next thing you know, like, we're just hitting 90. And like, it was funny seeing the video of him, because this is a kid who's been up to mid 90s before. He hits 90 and just doesn't even react, just turns around, just like a sigh of relief, house back on the mountain, just keeps going. But like, it's been nuts, because like the guys who are dealing with barriers that we can't figure out, we'll go through a square one session, all of a sudden the barriers are gone. Especially on a rehab process, whether it's TJ, shoulder, ACL, like, doesn't matter. I think if you're not utilizing a type of neural training, then you're already 5 steps behind. You can make that process significantly faster. That's my general overview.
Well, I appreciate that. I fear asking any questions of turning this into an 8 hour long podcast because I maybe I should have just left it alone, because now I have more questions than I had from when I started. So this is probably a good time for you to share any contact info or ways people can get in touch with you, because I'm guessing they're going to feel similarly to me.
Okay. So something I'm actually going to be starting up this month is, normally I don't take on any clients unless they're a full-time client. So you can find me on Instagram at Full Send Performance Training. Linktree is on there for you to be able to find Twitter, my website, applications, everything like that. But then I'm also going to add something to my application process here in the next 24 hours or so, as I've talked to a couple other people. But I'm going to add an option for just getting on like a 1 hour call, and either like if you're having pain issues, as long as it's not like physical damage, right? Like nerve system training can't fix physical damage. Like if you have a broken bone or something like that, like we're not just going to fix it. But whether you're having pain issues like that, you can actually go ahead and apply, and we can set up a call to go through a remote square one session. And on top of that, if you want to use half of that session to go over a mechanical analysis or whatever that may be, we can kind of leave those options up to it. But I'm going to start opening myself up for some more just like one-off calls with people. And then for the people who do want to actually train with me full time or need someone to help guide them through a return to throw process, that's where the full-time training really comes into effect. I think we've done some very different things than most guys do with the remote training. Obviously, we have an app, software, all that kind of fun stuff. But then we've got a group Slack account with all of our athletes where they can communicate. I can communicate to the group, whatever it may be. There's all kinds of fun things that I want to do within that community. And then another fun aspect is we're actually taking on another coach sometime this summer. Not quite ready to make that full announcement yet, but the team is growing, and so will our product offering with that. One thing that's been really evident within the remote training structure is once guys are in college, depending on the college, like we might not be able to do a lot for you. So I think we're actually going to start to get into a little bit more of, actually looking at pitch usage, analytics, and scouting reports for guys that are on the college realm as well to really help them dial in that aspect. I have this big, weird, audacious goal that in like 10 years, I'm also going to have agents on my payroll as well. So the goal is kind of be that one-stop shop, whether you're from the time that you're 13, 14 years old, you can come in and, we'll cover all the rehab, we'll cover all the training. We have the agency and advisement part in effect that makes recruitment and all that kind of fun stuff really easy. Transition to pro ball, we can be your one-stop shop. That's kind of like the overarching goal. But yeah, that's kind of all the things that you can kind of see coming out in the future.
Reach for the stars, so if you fall, you land on a cloud. I love it. Love the approach.
Absolutely.
Good for you. It sounds like we can close the book on this chapter of the chaplain at the Chapel of Cheddar's journey. Thank you for hopping on with us. It was great to talk to you, and we appreciate all the information. To all the listeners out there, thanks for laying back with us.